how's it going, guys, and welcome to the second episode of the Python introduction series. And in this episode we're going to be talking about data types and variables. So let's get right into it. Now first up, let's actually define a data type. Now a data type is basically the way to write data, basically a certain way to write data in. So with that said, there's 4 data types in Python. There are more advanced ones later on that we're going to take. They all deserve their own separate videos, but for now we're going to take the 4 most used and basic ones. Now the first one is going to be a string, which is basically anything in between these quotation marks right here or these singular quotation marks here. Now it's recommended to use the double quotation marks for reasons we're going to learn later, but for now just keep in mind that anything between these is a string. So let's say I type like any text in here, I type 1 2 3, I type any special character. This is all considered a string as long as it's inside these quotation marks. Next up we have the integer, which is basically any number. So 6, 8, 5, anything. Now, what's not considered an integer is anything with a decimal point. So 6.8, that's not an integer. That's actually another data type called a float. Now, a float is anything with a decimal in it. So 4.5 or 2.3. Now, anything that's like, for example, 8 or 9 wouldn't count as a float because it doesn't have a decimal point. And lastly, we have one that is not used very often, which is a boolean. Now, a boolean is basically true or false. These are the 4 data types. So with that said, let's move on to variables. Now variables are essentially ways to store the data, basically store the data types that we've just talked about. Now with that said, the way to create a variable is first you define the name of the variable. So for example, name, or basically a or box, anything as you want. I'm just gonna name it name. Now what you need to make sure is that it doesn't have any spaces. That's not a variable name. It doesn't have any special characters like a semicolon or a double quotation mark, for example. And you need to make sure that it doesn't start with a number. So this is not valid, for example. Basically, you can go ahead and make a variable like this, hit space, equal to, hit space, and then go ahead and type one of the 4 data types that we've just learned. So we can, for example, type a string here. So let's say my name is code and craft. Subscribe, by the way. And so with that said, this right here is the name code and craft is going to be stored in this variable. Now say I want to create another variable called number, and we're going to set it equal to, let's say, 6. There we go. We've stored an integer inside a variable. And let's say, for example, I want to create a decimal. We can't name it decimal. So let's, for example, I don't know, desc equals, and for example, 2.5. So we can go ahead and actually store different data types in different variables. And now if I go down, for example, and I go ahead and print the variable name, as you can see, because this variable, or you can think of it as a box, contains this certain value here. If I go ahead and run, as you can see, it's going to go ahead and print code and craft. So as you can see, this basically allows us to store different values in different variables. If I go ahead and, for example, print the number variable here, guess what's going to come out? 6. There we go. Basically predictable. Now, something that you might want to know is that if you put, for example, a number in a string, so let's say, for example, 8, you wouldn't be able to actually perform mathematical calculations on it. So for example, if I do 8 plus 1 here, and let's say I do 6 plus 2 here, can you predict what the answer will be? As you can see, if I print here, it will just say 8 plus 1 because it's inside the string. It takes it basically literally, but when converted to an integer, it can actually do mathematical calculations. Now, when it comes to a decimal, if you add a decimal with an integer, for example, and I go ahead and print the decimal value here, as you can see, it will get out the number as an integer. Even, let's say if we do 8.5, for example, the answer here rounds up to a 0, but it will still add this like 0.0 thing at the end because it's basically adding a float with a float, which is going to end up as a float anyways. Alright, and just one last thing I'd like to actually talk about, which is basically not needing to use like a million print statements to actually print something. Now doing this will basically make it so that they're in our own separate lines, but let's say we don't want that. Let's say we want them right beside each other. So with that said, you can basically go ahead and say hi, and then do plus, and then do the second thing, just like, for example. And so with that said, as you can see, there's this like, they're basically beside each other. Just go ahead and add a space to one of them, and you should be fine. There we go, it displays in the exact same line. But let's say you want to add that to an integer. It wouldn't work, obviously, because we can't add a string to an integer. So in this case, use a comma if you want to do that. So it's going to go ahead and print hi, and then it's going to go ahead and print 9. Click the video here next to learn about input statements.